Welcome everybody to a Center for Digital Play guest talk. I am extremely happy and I'm very excited to have Florence Nicholls visiting us today from Queen Mary
University.
Queen Mary's University. I should prepare these things. I think this is going to be a treat. I have actually invited Florence 3 times here before. I never managed, and it was my fault. Never managed to bring them here. And the whole point to me, sort of the way I get to know your work was this, to me, mind-blowing paper on archaeology and Elden Ring. And I thought, this is great. Who's this person? And then I learned that you're also a game maker, and that you also work with procedural content generation, and so like everything that's interesting, you're looking at. And I thought, well, we have to invite you here. And so finally, thanks to Elisa, we succeeded, and it's our great pleasure and honor to have you here. Give a talk on about how to be a game archaeologist. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be here, and especially to be able, have the time to talk about my research. So today I am going to be talking broadly about my PhD research that I've been doing over the last 4 years. Just to give a little bit of a background on me, so I'm now in the last year of my PhD, which is a computer science PhD, but actually that's not my background originally. I worked as an archaeologist in London for many years, and then made the leap across into computer science because I really wanted to do work on video game archaeology. But I've also worked on the game Salty Sea Chronicles, made by Digita Fabrique, who are actually based in Denmark, so that's another nice link. And I've done some curatorial work with the British Library, so I guess these are some of the things that I'm drawing upon in sort of my general background and practice. And just to give you a broad overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to introduce some of these concepts like video game archaeology, because you might be thinking, what on earth is that? Which is a very fair question. And then going on to talk about new methodologies, interpretive play, and also video game archaeology as HCI. So, step one, background. Makes sense to start with that. And I wanted to start us off actually with a personal anecdote. I feel like pretty much anyone who studies games has these personal anecdotes about playing games, especially when they were younger. And for me, the most memorable experiences I had playing games as a child was with my friend. We played Rayman 2 on the Nintendo 64. And I would go around to my friend's house because she was the one that had the console. But she didn't have a memory card, so this meant that we could never save our progress in the game, which meant that each time there was like this great tension of like, how far can we get this time? And it was very much like a roguelike, weirdly, in that way. Obviously, that game is not designed to be like that, but that was our experience. And for me, in a way, obviously, I have a personal connection with this game. I do like it, but almost like the actual specific play experience of being in that context with that friend, our shared enjoyment of that game, is just as important as the actual game software itself. So I'm really interested in play preservation, and that's kind of what I mean about the play experience. And in terms of kind of scholarship around video game preservation, people like James Newman and Ian Simons have made this point that actually future access to archival recordings, replays, and commentaries may be of more value than the continued ability to play those same games. So sometimes there is an emphasis on still having access to the software and hardware, which is of course very important. But as they say here, it's also important to think about having access to the recordings of gameplay experiences in a particular context, especially the specific historical context in which they happened. And when we look at kind of like video games now, even games that came out relatively recently are actually no longer accessible. This was the case with a case study I looked at the British Library. There was a game called The Cartographer's Confession, which was an app, which is no longer available on the App Store because it was removed. And that is only 7 years old. So we already have kind of like a situation where can't access games. But also just this year, there was a big adult game ban on both itch.io and Steam, and this disproportionately affected queer games, for example. So the reason why I put this kind of sort of timeline here is to sort of think, well, we know that we already can't access, or perhaps can't even access, play experiences around these games if they haven't been recorded. What does that mean in terms of thinking about the future and what people might be interested in terms of contemporary play experiences now? And I've included this quote from Melanie Swalwell, who is also someone who looks at video game preservation specifically in the context of Australia in the 80s and 90s, I believe. And of course, I like this quote because she says, we need to think more like archaeologists. Hold that thought. So, what is archaeology? This is actually, I put this in because it's a good question, kind of to transition to think about what is an archaeology of games. Archaeology, traditionally speaking, is the study of the human past through material remains. And so that's just kind of a good general definition to kind of put up front before going on to the next bit. So what is archaeogaming? This is probably like the question that I get asked most in regards to my research. And on a very basic level, you could say it's kind of the combination of archaeology and video games. I always include this picture of Lara Croft because it's often the example that comes up first of all. And actually, interestingly enough, there are a lot of archaeologists in video games, actually. But we can actually distill this down further. And actually, there are these sort of different complementary areas of archaeogaming that exist, or at least I would argue that exist. And one of them is representation. So thinking about the representation and specifically the ethics of how the past is represented in video games. And there's certainly a lot of scholarship around, for example, the Assassin's Creed games, which are very well known in terms of like being a way of playing in the past, so to speak. And also developing games with archaeological themes or by archaeologists would potentially also fit in this sub-area, I think. Another area is code archaeology. So John Aycock and Katie Bittner have done work in which they're trying to reverse engineer how games are made, basically on a like code level. So there's also that way of looking at it as well. But then there's the fieldwork side of things, which is treating games themselves as archaeological sites. And that is the kind of sub-area I would say that I am most interested in. I'm interested in all of these, and like they all are definitely not mutually exclusive. But this is kind of the area that I'm going to be talking about the most today. And in terms of kind of existing work that can be seen as like archaeological fieldwork in games, Andrew Reinhardt has probably done the most famous example of this, which was an archaeological survey of No Man's Sky. And he was the one that coined the term back in 2013 and wrote a book about archaeogaming as well. So that kind of really set a precedent. There's also other examples like Jared Hansen's work on recording kind of like player structures in Star Wars Galaxies. And the way I kind of think about doing archaeological fieldwork in games, I actually see a parallel with what is sometimes called space archaeology. It's a funny parallel to make at first, but archaeology isn't just the study of old things. There's also a discipline of archaeology called contemporary archaeology. You can do archaeologies of the contemporary world, and I think that video game archaeology really falls into this. And to give an example of space archaeology, there was this project on the International Space Station where they got astronauts to kind of like sample specific areas of that space. So there's like kind of a square here, and photograph it over time to see how they use material culture objects basically in that space, and they found some really interesting things out of that actually, in that humans, not surprisingly, don't use things how you would expect even on a space station. So I think there's some actually weirdly strong parallels with this work in terms of like trying to come up with new methodologies for places that would not traditionally be studied archaeologically. And here's this terrible diagram that I put together when I was trying to think about how to demonstrate like my research as being interdisciplinary because I feel like it kind of draws on all these different areas. Not just archaeology, computer science, but also HCI, game AI, game studies. And I feel that because video games are these kind of complex artifacts, objects, experience, however you want to describe them, they therefore like kind of require an interdisciplinary approach. So now I've set the scene with that. New methodologies. So one of the kind of major themes of my PhD research was coming up with new methodologies for archaeologically, kind of like recording or understanding video games. But the first case study I'm actually going to talk about is probably more on the ethnographic side, funnily enough. There has been a wealth of like ethnographic studies on video games, specifically MMOs in kind of like the early, or in the 2000s, which was like the golden age of MMOs. Kind of like concurrent with that, there was almost like a golden age of ethnographic studies of those MMOs. And this work builds on that. So the case study for this work was a game called Wurm Online. Has anyone here played Wurm Online? Okay, I'm really happy because this is the first time that I've had people in an audience who recognize this game, so that's kind of exciting for me. I wasn't expecting that. Okay, great. So if you don't know what Wurm Online is, it's an MMO that originally came out in 2006. It is still running, you can still play it, which is interesting. But also it has quite a small but consistent player base of about 100 players, I'd say. And I was really interested in this game for a couple of reasons. One of them is because actually it does have this kind of like, in games terms, quite long games history of like servers that have been online for a while. It's very much a kind of a sandbox game. A lot of the gameplay is around crafting things. But kind of doing anything in Wurm is really difficult. There's a lot of friction in terms of the design. Even doing like something very simple like digging a hole takes a considerable amount of real world time to do, for example. But another thing that's interesting about it is that it has a degradation mechanic. So if you don't maintain kind of structures or objects in the game, they will deteriorate over time. So as an archaeologist, obviously I was very interested in that and the player community and what was going on with this game. But the real thing that really got my attention is that, so I originally was introduced to this game because my supervisor had played it back in the day and said, oh, why don't I just show you this game? You know, just as a curiosity, we didn't think we were going to study it or anything like that. And pretty quickly, we found this big tunnel called the Dragonfang Pass, kind of in the middle of this server's map. And there's a sign at the entrance that says, oh, this is a designated heritage site. It's been designated by the Wurm community. You cannot alter this. I mean, I was like, what is going on in this game? This is so fascinating. I have to understand more about what this is, especially because to have constructed this tunnel would have taken thousands of real world hours. Someone or some people spent a really long time making this infrastructure in this game. And then it was designated as a heritage site. So what's going on? I want to know. So the question was, how am I going to study this? And sort of around about that time, I went to a summer school in Sydney, which is called the Hunt Symes Institute of Sexuality Studies Summer School, which actually, on the face of it, has nothing to do with games. But I met a scholar there called Sam Stiegler, who does this methodology called the go-along methodology, which is kind of what it sounds like. Essentially, you go along on a walk with a participant. It's usually sort of like an everyday walk of theirs, and it's very much directed by the participant, and it's sort of like a combination between an interview and participant observation. And Sam does work kind of doing go-alongs with queer youth in New York specifically, and it's really interesting work, so I would recommend looking it up. But I saw this and was really intrigued by it, and then kind of thought, well, does anyone use this methodology in a game? Because I was so interested in Wurm and kind of like the community's sense of place, connection with that space. And so this led to doing go-alongs in Wurm Online. So the way it worked is that we recruited people through Worm has its own kind of forum. So we did that, asked specifically for people who had some kind of a relationship with this tunnel, because that was just sort of like something to start with. And we conducted the go-alongs by kind of having voice chat through Discord, but then meeting them in Worm itself. So we would go along with them in the digital space on a walk. Then subsequently did thematic analysis on kind of the transcripts of the interviews, which I'll go into in more detail in a moment. But yeah, we had these, in the end, we had 3 different go-alongs, which are all quite different. The first one was with the curator of an in-game museum, and the in-game museum was near the tunnel, and they knew a lot about, of course, the history of this game. The second participant was the person who'd originally made the tunnel and had subsequently been banned from the game. That was a whole story that was incredibly interesting, but I couldn't actually include in the study because of ethics and stuff like that. But anyway, it's a very interesting backstory to that. And then the third was someone who had used the tunnel a lot. They'd played a lot on this specific server sort of 10 years ago and had a very personal connection with it. So it was interesting, these 3 different people who had specific connections with this game and with the specific location in the game. And as I mentioned before, we did this thematic analysis, and certain themes came out of it, and I'll just sort of highlight a few of them. One really interesting theme was this idea of a static versus living heritage, because the thing about making something a heritage site in Worm is that it really kind of just freezes it, so it can't be changed. Which in some ways is quite useful, for example, with a tunnel, because it's actually its infrastructure, so they don't want anyone to mess with it, because it's just useful for people to move through the map. But actually, one participant said to us that, well, it's great that you're looking at this this tunnel, but actually we have specific community events that are really important to us as a gaming community, and you could have come to see that. And so that was quite useful to sort of reflect on, the things that I'd been focusing on initially, but actually thinking about heritage in this game as being a living thing that's changed and being maintained all the time. And then sort of one of the other main themes is this idea of tending, which links back to, I mentioned earlier, the game is almost constantly, it needs its players to maintain it. But probably my favorite story from this research is one participant who said that they return to the game every 3 days, no matter what, to feed these giant dogs that they have in the game, because they originally had these dogs with their friends who used to play the game 10 years ago. And so they have this very personal relationship, with these digital dogs, and that's all part of their personal history with the game. And it was just really interesting to hear these very specific personal stories. And this is a screenshot from Rockcliffe Museum, which was the in-game museum I mentioned earlier, which is a memorial to players that had passed away. And I really like this quote from the curator, where they talk about the game being a sacred space, specifically because for them it's something that they created together. So I had lots of really interesting discussions with these participants, and the transcripts are all available on the Internet Archive as well. And yes, we published that as a paper, FDG, so if you're interested, you can find that and read more about it. Okay, so that's the first case study. And now, on to the next one. So just as kind of a precursor to this case study, I realized that actually really it kind of stems from work that I originally did back in 2018, prior to the PhD, where I looked at the game Near Automata, and in that game you can see kind of the corpses of where the players have died. And I tried to do this kind of a very rudimentary pilot study of kind of recording where I found these corpses. I say that because it will now link into this next case study, which I mentioned before is Elden Ring. I imagine more people here have heard of Elden Ring than Wurm Online. Elden Ring, which I'm sure many of you know about, is a kind of action role-playing game in some ways, in which is made by From Software, who are very well known for creating games that are very difficult. And one of the interesting things about Elden Ring is that if you're in the online mode, you can see messages left by other players in the landscape, and also bloodstains. And if you touch a bloodstain, you will see the last couple of seconds before that player died. So I was very interested in this because I feel like these are like traces of player activity, which could potentially be studied archaeologically. So the way that we approached this, because this was done back in 2022, so it was right when the game was originally released, and we really wanted to kind of capture a snapshot at this very specific point in time of the game where it has, big player base, and at that point we sampled these 2 locations in Limgrave, which is like the opening area of the game. It's right at the beginning. So the Church of Ella and the Stormfoot Catacombs. And I put this map here because to kind of demonstrate, it's really, I think of it like, it's like, I don't know, sampling a grain of sand in a desert or something. It's like, it's so small, of course, in terms of like the wider landscape and experience of Elden Ring. However, it was definitely a proof of concept in terms of how can you archaeologically record these player traces. And so the way the data collection process worked is that initially I wanted to draw these kind of to scale base plans of each location to then be able to record where messages were found within that space. And this was, of course, right when the game had released, and I decided not to use a mod or anything like that to do this. So the way that I was able to do this was by using the player's foot as a unit of measurement, because that is a standard form of measurement. So as much as it's a very strange thing to do in one way, I mean, it did work. And it was actually quite interesting from a researcher point of view in terms of like engaging with this space on a very like fine-grained level, like looking at what assets they've used, things like that. So I had a base plan in which to kind of like plot where these messages and bloodstains have been found. Also took screenshots, of course, as a reference, and then had a spreadsheet in which each individual message and bloodstain had an asset ID. And we also recorded context. And in archaeology, context is normally, in terms of different kind of deposits in the ground. Of course, when you're talking about a game such as Elden Ring, it doesn't really work like that. So for this, contexts were defined by noticeable changes in terms of different messages or bloodstains loading in or out of the specific space we were sampling. Because what often happens, let's say we were in a particular location for like half an hour or something, within that time messages can appear, disappear, and bloodstains as well. So we were thinking about on what day we surveyed this space, but also what kind of number of noticeable changes. And yeah, in terms of the 2 locations, we chose the Church of Ella because it's very much sort of like an early hub in the game, so to speak. There's a site of grace, which is a place where you can save, recover. There's also a merchant and a place where you can upgrade weapons. So this seemed like an interesting space to sample. And pretty quickly, we found a lot of messages that referred to a love. And then, kind of looking online, realized that, this refers to a fan favorite character called Rani, who a load of people are saying, this character can appear at this location at a particular time. So it was this is just one example of how kind of you get these sort of memes or like certain like player community practices emerging, which you can only really understand if you kind of look online and see the kind of conversations that are going on. Oops, sorry. And then the second place that we sampled was quite different. That was the Stormfoot Catacombs. It's very like long, narrow corridor we looked at, specifically because there's sort of enemies at either end of this, so it's a much more tense space. And I included this example of a message where it says, "Beware of up," because I like this in that there's a lot of examples in Elden Ring of messages actually misleading you or being deeply unhelpful. But at the same time, there are often messages which are actually quite earnest, like this, where someone is warning you, there's this imp up, to the right. and it's going to jump down and try and kill you when you get to the end of this corridor. And another kind of like major thing that came out of this was that we realised pretty quickly, of course, bloodstains let you see what a player is wearing or what gear they have. And this led to some kind of interesting observations. So, for example, in this screenshot, a player has the fingerprint stone shield. And this is an item that you can only really get like much further in the game. It's quite you get it from a very specific area. It's a late game item, but they're coming back, presumably, to the Church of Ella. And so we can make these inferences based on what kind of gear players were wearing that are recorded by the bloodstains. So it's kind of almost like an archaeology of fashion souls, so to speak. And we've actually done a follow-up study to this, which was focusing on the DLC release last year. And we also recorded ourselves doing the fieldwork, so had a lot of video footage. And that's a study that will hopefully come out next year. It hasn't been published yet. But I thought I'd just mention it anyway. It's we kind of built on this original study and really extended it. And yeah, you can find that original paper as well online. So, on to the next section, which is about interpretive play. Let's take a quick. Okay, so I'm really interested in how players form interpretations based on material culture they find in the environment of a game. And this is something that is kind of relevant to lots of different puzzle games generally, what are sometimes called Metroidvanias, which I think a lot of people hate this term, but it's also the one that people know, so that's why I'm referencing it. There are games like Return of the Obra Dinn, of course Heaven's Bolt, which is also an archaeological game, so it's a good thing to reference, or Blueprints as well. So I wanted to kind of reference that here. And also Elden Ring is relevant to this because it's a game with kind of opaque world building that players like to try and like figure out the lore of. So there is a link there between the last example and this section. So I've kind of introduced what archaeology is, and I think that there are really strong parallels between archaeological interpretation and how players interpret environmental storytelling, because both are about essentially interpreting material culture, whether that be in the real world or a digital environment in a video game. And so I really wanted to study how do players interpret environmental storytelling? How do, what process do they go through? On what basis do they make inferences, theories, that? And will it work? Yes. So the case study for this is a game called Nothing Beside Remains that me and my supervisor worked on. As you can see on the screen, it's a very simple, abstract 2D game in which you're this little @ symbol that walks around a ruined village. And if you bump into an object, you'll get a short description. There's no real fail state, you can't die. And you're not even like explicitly told what to do, but the idea is really implicitly you're being invited to kind of think about, oh, what happened to this place? Why is it like this? And for that reason, I thought that it would be a really good candidate for doing a player study on interpreting environmental storytelling. And Nothing Beside Remains uses procedural content generation, which is different from generative AI. I always say that every single time because the word generation, like generative, it has certain connotations now. So the setting is a ruined village, and essentially each time you play it, it will be different because you can kind of imagine it as having these like 2 layers of simulation, and it's almost like the game is rolling a dice, and depending on what you get, it might have been destroyed by, let's say, wildlife, and then that will have an effect on what material culture is then generated in the village. And this is also online, so you can have a go and play that game yourself. And yeah, to give an overview of the study, we had 202 participants in total complete an online player survey. in which they played this game and then filled out kind of a Google form which asked various questions, you can see here, very open-ended questions about asking participants, well, what do you think happened in this place, and can you give any reasons why? And also, we asked them if they could distinguish between procedurally generated and handwritten content, because I was interested in whether they could or not, or how they did that, which we'll get to in a minute. And so, out of this big study, then did a grounded theory analysis of all the responses and came up with this theory of the archaeological game world mental model. And this was very much inspired by a lot of players were talking about how a lot of the experience for them was actually in their head. A lot of, not necessarily exactly what was happening on the screen, although that was inspiring it, but it was all very kind of like an internal process going on. And there are sort of these kind of sub-themes of the theory, and one of which is pre-existing knowledge. So, not surprisingly, what we found is people would bring whatever kind of like knowledge or preconceptions they had. And what's interesting is that this is relevant in terms of the procedurally generated content as well. People would almost do like an archaeology of the PCG based on what they think they know about it. So someone would refer to Minecraft as almost like a canonical example of a game in PCG. Someone else referred to Pompeii when they were, interpreting the fictional village as almost, again, like a canonical example of an archaeological site that they knew. And then we had game world affordances, so things such as environmental and spatial affordances that really constrain the model. And so, for example, in archaeology, there's this concept of assemblage, so objects that are associated with each other. It felt like participants were very much kind of making inferences based on assemblages that they identified. Like, for example, there's a strange example of a 7-legged chair, but they were saying, okay, it's in a room with other chairs, so this must be a living area of some sort. At least that was the process, their own kind of like internal process for trying to form a theory of what was going on in that space. And then you have procedural affordances as well. So people would kind of recognize like strange repetition or phrasing in some of the writing, so they assumed that meant that something was procedurally generated rather than handwritten. Then we have archaeological game world affordances, and these are qualities that might challenge an existing kind of mental model or inspire a player to kind of build on it. And this is very much in terms of things like incongruous kind of content that they found, or ambiguity. So there's this example of a participant who says that there were altars and jugs for water, but no bodies of water in this village. So what's going on here? Did the landscape change? And things like that. And finally, recording method affordances. So we also asked them if they did record their gameplay experience, or if they were to, how would they do that? And we found that a lot of participants said that actually, whether that meant like drawing a map or taking screenshots or something like that, that would help sort of scaffold their mental model. Like in this case where someone says, it encouraged me to be systematic and observant of the space. So, after going through that, kind of what's the wider relevance? So, I'm really interested in kind of player recordings and player which are a kind of a way of players expressing their interpretations of a game as something that can be preserved as a contemporary play experience. And in a way, I think games that invite players to interpret environmental storytelling are kind of inviting players to role play as an archaeologist. And again, these papers are online. The second paper, that Down Sunstorm, I won't go into that now, but that was more about a glitch that players encountered in the game. And that was really interesting because it wasn't an intentional thing we put in, but people got stuck in the game and then assumed it was intentional and then formed a whole theory about the game world based on that, which was really funny, but also interesting. Okay, so we're now on the concluding part. So, video game archaeology as HCI. So I've talked about interpretive play, and kind of like this idea of interpretive agency is something that, for example, Tom Cole and Marco Gillis have discussed in terms of eudaimonic experience in video games. Always worried that I'm mispronouncing that. But kind of thinking about kind of like these kind of deep emotional experiences that players can have with games. And I think that thinking about interpretive agency, interpretive play, this kind of links back to that existing HCI work. And I'm also very interested in this idea of an anticipatory archaeology. Kind of mentioned earlier, thinking around like the need for play preservation now. You know, if we know that there are game experiences we don't have access to from the past, then we should record them in the present in anticipation of people wanting access to them in the future. And I think sort of the direction I really want to go, or one of the directions I'd like to go with this research is thinking more about how recording mechanics already exist in video games. There's something that we play with, you know, whether that be photography games, games that invite you to kind of write a diary. So thinking about how through game design we can actually kind of encourage players to interpret the game world, but also that being a way of kind of like preserving gameplay experiences at the point in which they happen, I suppose. And also, yeah, wanted to include this image from a zine that I actually worked on quite a while ago, back in 2018, and this image shows sort of people playing the same game but in different contexts. And I really love this article by E.T.L. Taylor, which is called The Assemblage of Play, which is very much arguing for looking at play not just in terms of, you know, what's happening on the screen, but the context in which people are playing. You know, what hardware are they using? How does gameplay, where is that in terms of what other people do they play with? Or, you know, are they playing on public transportation? Like, what is the wider context in which video game play fits in terms of our everyday life? And yeah, another kind of theme I think that I keep coming back to in my research is really thinking about putting the researcher back into the picture. This is an image, someone of I think it's a photograph of like a section, you know, in a trench, and like normally it wouldn't be good practice to like have your shadow in the image, you know. But I love this because I kind of assume that it is like an error or whatever, but because we have this kind of silhouette of this person, you can actually see the apparatus that they're using, right, to take this photograph. And so I just really like it, I guess, as sort of a way of making this point of thinking about capturing the researcher's experience as well. And also, yeah, I guess that's the end, but also I will be joining the Theorycraft project here next March. So yeah, moving to Copenhagen next year, which is exciting. I guess that's where I'm ending. Thank you.